Hello and welcome to California State Parks Portscast. Believe it or not, Mysteries of the California State Railroad Museum. It's our Halloween-themed program for ports. We are located here in California State Railroad Museum in Old Sacramento State Historic Park in Sacramento, California. My name is Debbie, and I'm joined here today by...
I'm Jake.
And I'm Rachel.
And we're here to talk about, as I said, some of the mysteries that we have found in the museum that you might find interesting. I'm going to start with what's right behind me here. We have a locomotive with the number 13. And believe it or not, that's a pretty rare sight to find the number 13 on a locomotive. All locomotives have numbers. But why would the number 13 be considered unlucky? Maybe you've heard that it's unlucky. Well, it goes back centuries. Back to the days of Jesus, and according to Christian teachings, when Jesus held the Last Supper with his disciples, the 13th guest was Judas Iscariot. Judas, as you may know if you're familiar with those teachings, went on to betray Jesus, which led to his crucifixion. So that number 13 has been considered unlucky ever since. So believe it or not, we've got a number 13 here, and as we go through the museum, maybe we'll see some other numbers and see if you can find a number 13 again.
So it's almost Halloween, and we're getting ready here at the California State Railroad Museum. And that's got me thinking, how many of you have ever seen a real monster before? What about a backwards monster? Or a monster that's the last of its kind? Believe it or not, we have a monster at the Railroad Museum that meets all of these characteristics. Behind me is the Southern Pacific's cab forward, and it is an absolute monster. It is not only the largest locomotive that we have in the museum, but it's also one of the largest locomotives that was ever built. As you can see here, it takes up most of the first floor of the museum. So the cab forward is really large. And that brings me to my first question for you all. Just how much do you think the cab forward weighs? Do you think it's about 40,000 pounds, 100,000 pounds, maybe a little bit more than that? Well, the cab forward actually weighs more than 1 million pounds. Now, that's a lot, but just how much do you think that is? Well, it's actually the weight of about 70 adult male elephants. The cab forward's also extremely tall. It's over 16 feet tall. So how high is that? Well, that's about the height of 2.5 professional basketball players stacked on top of each other. So the cab forward had to be really large and strong. And that's because it went through a really difficult route. It traveled up through the Sierra Nevada mountains near Lake Tahoe, and it specifically went through Donner Pass. This was a really difficult route for locomotives to travel. And because of the steep grades going up the mountains, they had to be very powerful and large to navigate. But remember back when I said that the cab forward was a backwards monster? Let's dive into that a little bit more. And to do that, we're going to compare it to the CP Huntington. So the CP Huntington is the locomotive that's located right next to the cab forward. And it's one of the locomotives, the earliest locomotives that we have here in the California State Railroad Museum. It was built about 80 years before the cab forward was built, and it helped complete the Transcontinental Railroad. So let's look at the CP Huntington a little bit more. At the back of the CP Huntington, you have what's called the cab. And this is where the railroad employees would operate the locomotive. Now in the front, you would have the smokestacks, and this is where the steam coming out of the engine would come out. Now let's pan back over to the cab forward here. You'll notice that the cab is located in the front like its name suggests. That's up there where all the windows are located. So why do you think the cab is located at the front of this locomotive? Well, Remember when I said that the cab forward traveled through the Sierra Nevada mountains? If you've ever been to Lake Tahoe in the winter, you know that it gets really cold and snowy up in the mountains. This made train travel really difficult. Because train travel during the winter was challenging and dangerous, the railroad companies built snow sheds over the tracks. And these were structures that covered the tracks to keep snow off and make it less icy and dangerous for locomotives and trains to travel. Now, this did cause a problem for earlier engines like the CP Huntington, and that was because of its design. So because the smokestacks were in the front and the cab was located in the back, that meant that the crew was breathing in all of the toxic fumes and smoke that were coming out of the locomotive. And because of that, because of those snow tunnels and sheds in the Sierra Nevada mountains, that smoke was being trapped, and the crews were breathing in all those toxic fumes. So that made it challenging and sometimes even deadly for crews to breathe in. So what was the solution to that? Well, it was changing the design of the locomotive. By putting the cab in the front, like the cab forward here, that meant that crews did not have to breathe in the toxic fumes. So this locomotive and its design really changed rail travel in California and across the US, but it also saved lives. Something else that's really cool about this locomotive is that it escaped the graveyard. When locomotives were no longer used, they were scrapped or taken apart for their pieces and sold for parts that were valuable. Now, this locomotive was meant to be scrapped, but it was saved and it was brought here to the museum, where it has been since the museum opened in 1981. Before it came to be in its final resting place here, it was stripped down to its skeleton, repaired and painted to appear as it does today.
Well, believe it or not, we actually have an immortal green monster here in the museum that I happen to be standing in front of. It's immortal because it's over 150 years old. And it's a monster because, well, a lot of monsters are green in color. Take, for instance, this green monster, the creature of the Black Lagoon. Pretty frightening looking monster. Or maybe you prefer this green monster. Ooh, I get scared just looking at her. The witch from the Wizard of Oz. Very green, yes. Or one more green monster that we can think of, and that would be this one. Frankenstein's monster himself, green in color. Well, as you can see, this is also green. But let's take a look at the immortal part of this car that I am standing in front of. It's immortal because it has a lot of lives. And I'm going to take the time to read to you about its different lives right here. A lot of lives, so a lot of information, so I'm going to be talking really fast. Okay? Are you ready? Yeah, a lot of lives. Okay, starting in 1868 to 1869, this car was called the Commissioner's car. Why was it called the Commissioner's car? Because commissioners from the railroad rode on it. This car actually witnessed some of the greatest historic events in the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, most importantly, the Golden Spike ceremony on May the 10th, 1869. This is the only surviving car that was actually at that ceremony more than 150 years ago. Well, then from 1869 to 1871, it became Crocker's car. Charles Crocker used the car. In 1871 to 1873, it became the director's car because some of the directors of the railroad, including Leland Stanford and C.P. Huntington, enjoyed travel time on this very special car. Well then, in 1873 to 1875, it became Cohen's car for a man named Cohen that owned it. He sold it to Nevada's Virginia and Truckee Railroad. Then it was known as the Bonanza car. But now, 1875, you know what, it's kind of old and it's out of fashion. So from 1878 to 1938, it changed completely and became Express Car number 17. And what does that mean? It was a passenger car, so they put passenger seats and baggage racks in the car. Okay, we're about halfway through. Lots of lives to talk about. 1920, it's called the Suffrage Special. The Suffrage Special means that there were 30 women who traveled from Reno, Nevada to Carson City, Nevada to witness the governor's signing of the approval of the 19th Amendment. And what was that 19th Amendment? It gave women the right to vote. Then, after that, 1938 to 1972, it got ready for its close-up and became a movie star. Starred in several different movies, including Love Me Tender, starring Elvis Presley himself. This car was in that movie, and a number of other movies. But you know what? By about 1956, the studios weren't really interested in railroad equipment, so this car kind of just sat in a field all by itself for several years. And what happened while it was there? Well, it got these holes in it, and the holes were actually drilled by woodpeckers. Woodpeckers got at the car, so that explains what all of these holes were for. But that wasn't done. It wasn't done yet, because in 1972, its movie star days behind it. But you know what? It became a TV star, and it starred in TV shows like The Gambler, starring Kenny Rogers. I have to catch my breath, but that brings us up to 1988, where the Nevada State Railroad Museum actually purchased this car, and then it took on life as a museum exhibit. Well, there you go. There are all the lives of this car that we call the Commissioner's car, which was the first name of it. But we're very fortunate to have it here in our museum. It's on loan to us from the Nevada State Railroad Museum for the next year. So if you're ever in the area, please stop by to take a look at it, because it may not be here it'll only be here for another year. So I did say that this was an immortal monster, right? And immortal, yes, we can see with all these lives how it became immortal. But I'm not sure it would be a monster. What kind of monster would we describe it as? Maybe a vampire? Vampires live for centuries and don't age, and this has been alive for more than a century, but you can tell it's pretty aged. Maybe a ghost. Ghosts die and then they come back as apparitions, but this is definitely not an apparition. It's real life. So maybe not a ghost exactly. How about a zombie? What are zombies? Zombies die and then they come back to life. But I think, once again, we didn't really see this car die, right? It's still here. It's still alive. So I was thinking maybe we shouldn't call it a monster, but something else. I'm thinking that I'm going to call it this, a cat. Because what are cats? Some people consider them to be very mysterious, but cats are known to have more than one life, in fact, 9 lives. And this car, as we said, has, well, about 11 lives. So let's just call this a mysterious green cat. Believe it or not.
Well, believe it or not, our mannequins here in the museum are based off of real people. And they've been a favorite of guests here at the Railroad Museum since it opened in 1981. And fun fact, these mannequins aren't just modeled after real people, but they're modeled after the people that helped make the Railroad Museum possible. But making these mannequins was a really challenging and difficult process. It was also really uncomfortable for the people that helped were the models for the process. So, interestingly enough, these mannequins aren't just modeled after real people, they're the actual cast, including the face of the people who worked here at the Railroad Museum or in state parks. So maybe some of you have broken a bone before, or you know someone that's broken a bone. If you have, maybe you've gotten a plaster cast before. This process is pretty similar to how the mannequins were made. So let's talk a little bit about how they made these mannequins to appear so lifelike. So the artist that worked on these mannequins first put a gel on the participant's face. And Debbie found some pictures of the process here, and this is what it looked like. So as you can see here, they put the gel on the person's face for about 30 to 40 minutes. And they actually had to cover their eyes, their mouth, and their nose. So as you can imagine, this was really uncomfortable. For the models, they actually had to put straws up their nose so they could breathe during the process. After this gel was applied, they then put on a layer of plaster. And plaster goes on as a liquid paste, and then it hardens into a solid mask that takes the face of the model. So this makes it more lifelike in appearance. But this whole process took at least an hour, and sometimes took longer. So imagine having to lay still there with straws up your nose, with your eyes closed, with paste over it for at least an hour, if not 2 or 3 while it's set. So a lot of the models that were used to help make these mannequins said it was really uncomfortable and claustrophobic, and that they wouldn't consider doing it again in the future. So the artist then painted the faces of the mannequins, added realistic details including glass eyes and hair, and we dressed them in railroad appropriate attire that was donated to the museum. So that brings up the question, why do we have mannequins here in the museum in the first place? Well, a lot of these mannequins represent different jobs and careers on the railroad. These mannequins behind me here are the traqueros, and they were railroad workers who helped make the railroad possible. We also decided to put the mannequins in the museum because it made it more exciting to display the railroad appropriate attire. It was more exciting than putting them in an exhibit case. You might even say it made them a little bit more lifelike.
Going up.
So believe it or not, the California State Railroad Museum keeps an extra hand or two just laying around ready to spring into action. And believe it or not, that is actually true. I have a prosthetic hand right here with spring fingers just ready to leap into action for us. And these prosthetic hands have to operate a little bit differently than your traditional prosthetics, like the prosthetic leg we have on display right there as well. Because a prosthetic hand has to be able to manipulate objects, grab onto things, and do all the many things that our hands let us do traditionally. So the very first prosthetic that we actually have evidence for dates all the way back to ancient Egypt, about 3,000 years ago. So prosthetics have been used for a very long time, but fancy ones like this with springs, those are fairly new, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But I want to focus on that early prosthetic real quick. So that we actually have evidence of is from a mummy. So he had 2 prosthetic big toes on that ancient Egyptian mummy. And mostly it was for cosmetic reasons, but it did also serve a purpose for religious ceremonies. So ancient Egyptians, it was really important for them to wear specific sandals to do some of their ceremonies and rituals. And without the big toe, they weren't able to wear those sandals. So that's why that ceramic prosthetic toe was built for those ancient Egyptians. And prosthetics remain fairly similar to that, made out of simple materials, mostly used either for cosmetic reasons or for balance or light things like that, like your prosthetic legs here. All the way up until the 1500s. That's 2,500 years where prosthetics were fairly similar to each other. But we have a big leap forward in the 1500s in France, where people start using springs in prosthetic hands, making them easier to grip onto stuff and much more accurate. Before that, think of like Captain Hook. You had to use hooks and things like that for your prosthetic hands. So this whole exhibit talks about railroad safety. Working on the railroad is a very dangerous thing to do. As well as up above here, you see some railroad nurses that worked on the railroad as well. And if we come back this direction, we're going to be showing off one of the most dangerous jobs that affected hands in railroading. All right, you guys are going to walk with me this direction. As we do so, the job I'm going to show you is the brakeman job, putting couplers together. You can actually see one of our mannequins doing that right here. You guys saw him earlier in the video. All right, we're going to keep on walking. We have the Monterey and Salinas Valley Railroad car right here. That's going to be one of the cars we talk about. And then a little bit further than that, we have the Silver State, one of my favorite cars here at the museum. All right, so what I want to show you, and this is the best place to do it in the museum because we have both the couplers in action here, is the difference between our Lincoln pin versus our automatic coupler, which we'll talk about here in a second. So this is the traditional method. This was the dangerous method using Lincoln pins. So this is the link. And as a train car needed to be coupled together, put together on those consists, the brakeman would be responsible for dropping the pin at the perfect time, making sure that the train cars came together. Very dangerous. So if I'm the brakeman, I'm standing here, I'm picking up the pin right here, and I'm waiting for the Silver State to come close enough for me to drop it at the perfect time, connecting these 2 train cars together. This was very dangerous. There used to be a joke among brakemen that you could tell who was the new guy, who was just starting out their career as a brakeman, because that person would have all 10 fingers. So if you saw somebody with all 10 fingers, they weren't a brakeman for very long. So there were improvements on this. People understood that this was not the best case scenario, and there were ways to improve it. And eventually they invented something called the automatic train coupler. So we're going to show you a video of that as well. And the brakeman would no longer have to stand between the 2 cars, would no longer have to time the link perfectly to make sure the train cars came together. They would just push together and couple automatically. And this was something that helped make railroads much, much safer. But remember, the prosthetic hand we learned about was from the 1940s, and this law that went into effect is from 1893. So it still wasn't perfect. There were still many things that could go wrong on the railroad that would lead to things like prosthetic hands or legs. So this was a very dangerous thing to do. So thank you all for joining us for this program today. This is the last of our Believe It or Not. I hope you guys had a wonderful time, and I hope you have a wonderful Halloween.